Good afternoon, everyone from Geneva. It's Tony Consul, the head of communications here at IATA. I'm joined in this briefing by our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, as well as our Chief Economist, Brian Pearce. Today, we're announcing the traffic results for September for both cargo and passenger. So Brian will take us through a short presentation. And from that presentation, we'll go directly into questions and answers. Questions and answers, as usual, will be taken through the chat function. So please get your questions in early so that we make sure we get to them in the time allocated. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to take us through what happened in September.
Thank you very much, and good day to everybody. Well, let me start by comparing what's happened to the global air travel market measured by growth in RPKs against the cargo market measured by growth in CTKs. What we've seen is essentially the recovery in air travel that we've been seeing in the 6 months since that low point in April is stalling, is certainly slowing down very quickly. We've ended up at a point in September where global air travel is 72.8% down on the previous years. That's an improvement of 2.5 percentage points from the August figure. And the months before that, we had been seeing improvements of perhaps 5 percentage points a month. So we have seen a slowdown as we have seen the second waves of COVID lead to further travel restrictions. By contrast, the cargo performance has been much better and in fact speeded up in September. Cargo ton kilometres flown was 8% down on the year in September, and that's a marked improvement and an acceleration from what we've seen in recent months. So let me just have a look at what's going on in the air cargo part of the airline's business. It's a smaller part of the business for most airlines than the passenger business, but important nonetheless. And we're about to enter the peak season for air cargo, which is the fourth quarter, October and November, typically where there are lots of product launches. And of course, we're looking into 2021. Hopefully, there will be the need to distribute vaccines as well. And the problem that cargo is facing at the moment is actually a shortage of capacity. As you can see here, freighters are extremely busy. Freighter capacity up 20%, average hours flown, almost 11 hours, which is exceptional. But the grounding of the passenger fleet, in particular the wide-body aircraft that typically carry roughly half of the cargo volumes, has only improved marginally, with many services just not able to start up again given the travel restrictions. The consequence for cargo capacity, though, is although traffic volumes are only down 8%, the amount of available capacity is down 25%. So obviously load factors are very high, 57%, up 10 percentage points from where they were last year. And if we look at the demand side for air cargo, that looks very strong. We're actually seeing very strong new export orders for manufactured goods coming out of the business sector. You can see here that is actually above pre-crisis levels and is clearly very supportive for further growth in the volume of air cargo shipments. Interestingly, though, the performance of cargo volumes, cargo ton kilometres flown by trade lane is very different. The North Pacific trade lane actually has seen sort of very little adverse impact of the crisis. In fact, it's growing at a stronger rate than before the crisis compared to the within Asia market. And remember that Asia is the manufacturing center of the world. There are lots of the supply chains based there. That is normally the hub of air cargo activity, of assembly. That's down at pretty weak levels. Now, why is there this difference? It's partly, I think, because of freighters. 90% of cargo is carried by all cargo freighters on the North Pacific route, whereas on the within Asia market, that's typically relied on the passenger aircraft. And obviously, many of those services are grounded because of the travel restriction. I think the other thing to point out is that the positive demand environment for cargo is driven by what's happened in the wider economy. And if we look at the confidence of businesses, outside of air transport, where confidence is still pretty low, the confidence of manufacturing and services companies is actually really strong. It's recovered very sharply from the lows at the depth of the crisis. And for economies like China, Germany, the United States, even the readings taken in October were above pre-crisis levels. And this is highly correlated to GDP. And we obviously saw that third quarter rise of US GDP at an annualized rate of over 33%. So, clearly, if there's that sort of growth, there's a demand for air cargo. I think the problem now is that Europe is going into lockdown. And as you can see, with the case of the French business sector, confidence had fallen quite sharply earlier on. And I think we're in for more difficult trading conditions and clearly weaker demand for cargo in the fourth quarter from Europe. But actually, China is still looking very confident, and as is the US. It's a very different story, though, when we look at travel, and that's obviously driven by what's been happening to the virus, and in particular, the surge of new COVID-19 cases in Europe. As you can see, this is obviously beyond the September data that we've been talking about. So the situation has deteriorated dramatically since that data, but it had started. We'd started to see that second wave of coronavirus cases in Europe, and that was affecting the September data, but it's got worse. And indeed, in the US, we've actually seen a third wave, a third upturn in cases. But contrast that with what's happened in China and a number of other Asian economies where the virus is still under control. And that's leading to some very different performance in air travel markets and passenger outcomes. This is the overall impact of what we've seen through to September. Internationally, it had been weak. We'd seen a pretty weak recovery through to August. But as you can see, September data shows that has gone into reverse. September growth for international air travel, RPKs, was actually lower than it was in August. Not by much, but clearly we've seen a stalling of the already weak recovery that we'd seen on international markets. Domestically, domestic air travel markets have been much more buoyant. They've certainly shown a willingness to travel, but even there, you can probably see the slope of that line is tipping down. We're at a point where now we're 43%, just a bit more than 43% lower than last year, much better. But there's a slowdown even so visible in domestic markets. And if we look below that domestic market total, you can see that there's still a very wide range of performance between different domestic air travel markets, from the full recovery that we've seen in Russia, although the surge, the renewed rise in coronavirus cases in Russia has stopped that improvement, as you can see in the September numbers. And China, which is more or less at full recovery, and in fact, if anything, speeded up in September. Clearly, cases are under control in China. The situation in the Chinese domestic market is looking rather positive. Contrast that with fairly disappointing performance in the US and in Australia, where we've seen, again, a rise in cases leading to a renewed setback in that market, which had barely began to improve. And then turning to international markets, this shows a range of the larger international route areas. And it shows that what recovery we had seen in international travel was the within Europe market, principally the within Europe market, as the travel bubble was established in Europe. But this sharp increase in coronavirus cases has led to renewed travel restrictions even within that bubble, and we've seen a decline in September in that market. One market where we have seen an improvement, perhaps the only other market where we've seen an improvement, has been between the North and Central America. And note that a number of the Central American economies, Panama and others, have opened their borders with a requirement for testing, and that does seem to be generating some travel, as we can see here. The trouble for the industry is that North to Central American market is only 1/10 of the within European market, so barely enough to make a dent on the global numbers. But what I would say, and I think what we have seen in the bookings data, is that there is latent demand to fly. This shows the UK to the Canary Islands, and it shows bookings between August and October. And when the UK lifted the quarantine requirements for travel to the Canary Isles, as you can see, bookings jumped enormously, up 112%. I would say, of course, we now, or rather UK citizens now face renewed restrictions with the lockdown in the UK. But I think this is evidence that if it's possible, people do wish to travel. And then my final slide is really making the point that the restrictions that we're seeing being put in place are really quite important in determining the extent to which we see any revival in air travel, particularly on international markets. And we've shown before the situation, the comparison in Europe between countries with quarantine and countries with full travel bans and the equivalence of that. And we can see the same here in Latin America between Paraguay and other Latin American economies. It makes no difference if a full quarantine is in place to a full travel ban. But those economies that have opened borders with a requirement for testing have seen a much better situation. And these bars show bookings in the first 2 weeks of October compared to the same period last year. And as you can see, improvements of 10, 20 percentage points on those markets which either are closed or have the requirement to enter but with a quarantine. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. We have lots of questions in the queue already, so we'll take those one at a time. In the meantime, though, I would encourage others to do type your questions in, and we'll get to them in order. So the first question talks about the traffic estimates and suggests that, or reminds us that earlier this year we revised estimates going forward for traffic development. Do the results in September lead to a further downward revision of the long-term traffic evolution?
No. You're quite right that we did revise down our forecast for 2020. So a few weeks ago, we presented those. But that was on our observation of the second waves of coronavirus coming through and the reaction of governments with travel restrictions. So actually the last 2 months have been in line with the revised forecast that we published. If you remember, we revised down our expectations that previously we'd thought that by December, global RPK growth would be down 55%. We now think it's going to be down, I think we said 68%, for a full year average of down 66%. So these numbers are consistent with that forecast.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a few questions on cargo. With the relative better performance of air cargo versus passenger, do you see airlines converting on a permanent basis parts of their fleets to freighters?
Well, certainly in the short term, I think this is a really important source of revenue. It's it's enabling a number of longer haul services to be cash positive because of the cargo revenues that are available. But I'm not sure this is going to be a longer term phenomena. Cargo historically has been 15% of airline revenues. It's probably 20-25% of many airlines at the moment. But that's partly because of the shortage and the impact that that's having on yields, because the capacity is so short. Yields are very good. That's not going to stay that way. We'll see more capacity coming onto the market because of conversions, because of new deliveries, and hopefully, as we see testing opening up markets, we'll see more passenger aircraft coming back. So I think that will bring those yields down. Cargo will not be as profitable as it is today, and won't make quite so much of a difference. So I think it's it's something that we're going to see for the next sort of 6 to 12 months, probably not long term.
Okay. We have a further question on cargo, reminding us that earlier in the crisis, we saw lots of pictures and reports of not sort of conversions of aircraft, but using passenger aircraft with boxes on seats and basically loading the passenger cabin with cargo. Is that still going on, and how effective has that been in meeting demand?
I think less so. I think it's proving that there are practical issues, difficulties in utilising seats on passenger aircraft to carry boxes. So my understanding, our reading of the data is that that's less prevalent now. I think we've seen a stabilisation in the use of passenger aircraft for freighter purposes. But I think airlines are certainly utilising the belly capacity of aircraft. We're seeing the use of passenger aircraft being deployed as networks start up and routes start up. Cargo is a really important driver of the viability, at least in sort of operating cash terms for those services. But I think it's sort of largely in the belly holds of those passenger aircraft.
Okay. We have a question going back, I guess, to some of the analysis that we presented last week. So the questioner asks, first off, how critical is it for public financial support for airlines at this point in time? And the second part of that question is, on average, how many months cash does the average airline have to survive?
Yeah. Airlines are still burning through cash at the moment. Even if some of their flights are generating cash because of the cargo load, they're still losing money because their fixed costs and the grounded fleet that they have. We estimate that airlines were burning through cash in the second quarter at about $50 billion. It was only slightly less in the third quarter, judging by the results that are coming out. So the support of governments is still critical at this stage. It's becoming different. The need initially was life support to keep airlines alive while they were grounded. Now the challenge is to make the restarted routes and networks economically viable again. And the challenge, particularly on the passenger services is that yields are just so low and costs are relatively high for a number of reasons. So government support is really essential here still.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Alexandre, did you want to add anything to that in terms of the criticality and the kind of support that airlines need at this point?
No, it's okay. Brian did a very good job.
Okay, thank you. And then a last question in the same vein. What are the opportunities for airlines to cut costs? And can they cut costs fast enough to keep up with the drop in revenues?
I think that's our worry at the moment, that we've seen such a catastrophic drop in passenger revenues. And even next year, our estimates are that revenues might be perhaps 1/3 of what they would be in a normal year. So airlines have to get their costs down to that much lower revenue level in order to turn cash positive and to stop draining away their resources. And that requires big cuts in costs. And the trouble in this sort of industry is that many of those costs are, to a large extent, fixed. With big aircraft assets, even those aircraft that are leased have contracts that make it quite difficult to just hand them back. And I think there's a real need for the industry to look at ways to make its cost base much more flexible. We've seen this with the engine, if not the airframe, with power-by-the-hour contracts. I think given these sorts of shocks, we're going to need to see more flexibility in these big fixed costs. Fuel is typically the biggest cost, and fortunately, fuel prices have fallen. Although, because the rest of the economy is in a stronger position, unfortunately, energy prices are relatively firm, so they're not likely to get much cheaper. Labour costs, I guess, is the big cost that most airlines have. So there are some difficult decisions ahead, because the industry has got to downsize itself, given that revenues and the travel market are likely to remain much smaller than expected for a number of years rather than a number of months.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Another question on cargo. With the uptick in cargo, is the benefit mostly by all cargo carriers or relatively evenly shared between network carriers that also have cargo in their fleet? How do we see those two business models performing?
Well, I think we've already seen the all cargo carriers and the integrators, actually performing quite well in this crisis, because the global economy needs the air cargo services to support global supply chains. We've all used e-commerce much more than we have done in the past, so much of that is flown around. So the all cargo carriers have not seen the catastrophic drop in revenues that the passenger airlines have. But I think that we're certainly seeing that the passenger aircraft, the airlines serving those markets, particularly with wide-body aircraft, are able to share to some extent. The real challenge for those airlines at the moment is that many of the passenger markets that those wide-body aircraft would typically be deployed on are shut. And so it's quite difficult to get that capacity in service again while travel restrictions remain as they are, which is why we're obviously pushing for a testing solution so strongly.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question precisely on testing. And the questioner asks if the new waves of infections that we're seeing in Europe and also in North America are impeding or stalling the efforts of IATA and others to get countries to adopt universal testing programs. Alexandre, maybe did you want to take that?
Yeah, I can. Of course, the new waves are not, facilitating our job, of course, and so we have to be even more convincing to consolidate the result of the experiment that are conducted in many airports or with many airlines, to bring additional data and to have even a more robust testing proposal to convince the health authorities that it can replace the quarantine measures.
Okay. Thanks, Alexandre. Also on testing, we have a question that asks, how close are we to having ICAO publish standards for testing?
I'm not sure that ICAO will publish standard for testing. They will publish recommendation, to restart the aviation, to reopen borders or to implement safe processes, including testing. And things should be ready by the 10th of November, hopefully.
Okay. A further question on testing, and it refers to antigen testing. And the question is, first off, is IATA calling for antigen testing? And if so, has it received the backing of health authorities for that?
No, first of all, it's a question that is more directed to the head of the laboratories producing health tests. What we see is that the tests are very often, and particularly when it comes from very serious companies, they come with a protocol of testing. And so what has to be approved or sealed or stamped or whatever or recognized by health authorities is a couple, including the test and the protocol of testing. Because otherwise, whatever test you are talking about, whether it's antigen, PCR, or antibody, if you do not follow the protocol, the accuracy, the sensitivity, the reliability of the test is absolutely is a nonsense. Huh? It has to follow a strict protocol. So what we would like to do is to have tests that are approved or recognized by health authorities, plus including a protocol, to be sure that the process is safe.
And also this week we have seen the ECDC also warming its, I suppose, look towards antigen testing. Is that correct, Alexandre?
The ECDC doing what? Sorry?
The ECDC was publishing more, I suppose, optimistic comments on the...
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. The ECDC is publishing more optimistic comments. So we are pretty optimistic that we will be able, to have health authorities, more and more health authorities recognizing the process. But the process has to be safe. Safety is our number one priority. Health safety as other items on safety, and so we have to guarantee to states, to health authority, to passengers, that the process we are proposing is the right one. And so we are working with the laboratories, with the health authorities to consolidate the reliability of the whole process, to give health authorities and government enough comfort to remove the travel restrictions and the quarantine measures.
Okay.
And we are working with medical community on that.
Okay. And then I guess a further question in that area In the discussions that you're having with governments and other international organizations, are there major obstacles that you see that need to be overcome, or is it simply a matter of defining the process and moving forward?
The major obstacle is always the same. We have to give a solid comfort to government, to health authorities that have implemented travel restrictions and quarantine measures, that they can remove these travel restrictions and these quarantine measures in exchange of implementing a safe process. So we have to give some comfort and guarantees on the safe on the features of the process, to guarantee that this testing process is absolutely reliable and safe. That's the point. It's not an obstacle, but it's a precondition to convince government to reopen their borders without threatening their population or by re-importing massively the virus.
Okay, thanks, Alexandre.
It doesn't change, but it is clearly focused on the safe, reliable features of the process we are proposing.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a slightly different track of questions. Looking into 2021 and considering that some parts of the world seem to be coming out of the crisis with very low infection rates, other parts of the world are having much higher infection rates and second waves or third waves. The question is, do we see potentially a two-speed industry developing in 2021? Or are there any other expectations we would see in the aviation environment for the coming year?
I think that's right. I mean, if I could sort of pick that one up first. I think we're already seeing a two-speed industry. We're seeing domestic markets showing that people want to fly again, and we're seeing full recoveries in domestic markets like China, which is the second biggest, Russia, and a number of other Asian economies. Some of those, what we are seeing is, and we've seen that in Korea and Vietnam, if there's a resurgence of the virus, then that travel stops pretty quickly. But it's quite robust. It's in Korea and the Vietnamese case, we've seen second waves knocking back the travel recovery, but it's coming back again. Whereas on international markets, I think it's very much restricted by the measures that are being put in place by governments. And so even where we have travel bubbles or corridors, green lanes, often it's restricted to business purposes only, or there are some quite difficult bureaucratic processes to go through. So that's made people reluctant to travel, or it's made it impossible to travel. And so I think in 2021, we have already, as we've said, revised down our expectations of growth. We think it will be a recovering year, but probably more in the second half than the first. And it's not clear at this stage how widely distributed or indeed how effective any vaccine will be. I think it's going to be really important in the first half of the year to get in place a sort of testing regime that Alexandre's been talking about.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Brian. Alexandre, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think I'm perfectly in agreement.
Okay. Then we have a couple of questions on the impact of Europe's second wave and lockdowns. First, the impact that will have on European flight demand. So Brian, maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think we've already seen that in the bookings data, which is down significantly in the fourth quarter. We started to see that within Europe. Travel in September slowed down from the previous month's improvements. I think in the fourth quarter, we'll clearly see a pretty sharp setback. because we've got lockdowns, not just travel restrictions, we've actually got lockdowns in a number of European economies once more, as we had in the spring. So I think that means we're talking about a two-speed world. Europe is certainly going to be suffering quite substantially, I think, from the current situation. Hopefully it will work in getting the coronavirus under control. But contrast that with what's happening in China and a number of other Asian economies where we're seeing pretty strong recoveries. Obviously not on international travel in that region, but certainly in some of the domestic markets. But no, I think Europe, unfortunately, is facing quite a sharp downturn.
Okay, and then a second element to that is what is the impact of the situation in Europe on the superconnectors in the GCC?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that a general rule has been we've seen a recovery in short-haul travel, particularly domestic, and the longer-haul markets have been much more challenging because of travel restrictions. Now, I know that in the Gulf, the authorities have made substantial effort through testing and discussions with partners to get travel going again, connecting through those hubs. But Europe is one of the major markets for travel from Asia via those superconnector airlines and hubs in the Gulf. So that is going to be damaging.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question on the overall financial situation, not of airlines specifically, but more broadly. The questioner asks about air traffic control, ground support companies, the whole aviation ecosystem. How concerned are we about potential failure in our business partners?
Let me just start. I'm sure Alexandre's got some things to say about this, but I guess what we've seen in the past is that suppliers to the airline sector, in particular the infrastructure providers, so airports and ANSPs, have been, many of those have either been government owned, and so have the support of governments, which is the case for most ANSPs, or very high credit ratings. Investors see many airports, certainly the larger airports and medium-sized airports, as very good credit. So they have access to the debt markets to borrow money to a much greater extent than the airline sector. But having said that, I think we need the whole ecosystem to be in place and healthy, and so support is needed to those sectors as well. But I think that support needs to come from governments. If airports and NSPs start to put their charges up, that's going to make air travel more expensive and make the demand situation even worse than it is.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Alexandre, you recently did a joint conference with the Director General of ACI. Did you want to comment on maybe some of the joint efforts we're making with our partners on behalf of the industry?
I will say the same thing as Brian. We need to have a common approach to government support, because we need all the elements of the value chain to be sustainable, whether it's airports or ground handlers or caterers or aircraft manufacturers, OEM, etc. So the whole aviation industry, and including all its members, is probably needing some help from government.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question about the UK. They've announced a lockdown which is particularly tough, and also, as I understand it, does not allow leisure travel. And we have seen other areas where there are business green lanes, etc. The questioner is asking, first off, do we agree that the lockdown in the UK seems to be much stronger with respect to air transport than in other parts of the world? And then the second element of that is where the purpose of travel is being policed or restricted, how is that actually implemented by airlines, or is that a government measure? So, Brian, maybe you want to start on the first part with respect to the severity of the lockdown and the potential impact on the industry?
Yes. We saw earlier, didn't we, that the UK government had only just relaxed its quarantine requirements for UK leisure travel to the Canary Islands, and we saw that huge jump, 112% increase in bookings in early October, only to slam on the brakes with the lockdown. So, clearly that's extremely damaging to the travel industry as well as the airline sector. And clearly, health is a priority here. But I think that we need to be looking at ways of preserving jobs as well. And clearly, the byproduct of these measures is going to be that jobs will be lost in the travel and tourism sector.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question about vaccine transportation. And the questioner basically asks, if we get a vaccine earlier than maybe anticipated or in the near future, will carriers be able to meet the demand for time temperature-controlled transport with the current state of the fleet and the aircraft that are operating?
I mean, perhaps I could start on this. I mean, Alexandre, I don't know whether you could comment on the talks that IATA have been having with its supply chain partners on this very issue, but just a broad observation that a lack of capacity, or the capacity that is available for the cargo sector, air cargo sector, is a real challenge at the moment. That could be unlocked if we saw a testing regime allowing the resumption of some of the passenger services, particularly on the longer haul market, which would bring back the wide body capacity that would be so helpful in distributing such a vaccine. But we are in discussions with various institutions on this very issue.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a precision on some comments that you made earlier, Alexandre. The questioner is asking when you would expect further recommendations from ICAO on testing. Are you looking at mid-November, or is that into December?
No, it's we hope to have that by mid of November.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, just again a precision. The questioner wants to make sure that IATA does not have a preference between PCR or antigen testing.
No, it's not a matter of preference. When we have launched our proposal, to have systematic testing, we said that the testing should that the test should meet some criteria such as reliability, sensitivity, speed, cost, and from that point of view, the antigen testing is meeting up these criteria better than the PCR, because they are less costly and they are much faster. In terms of reliability, they are below the PCR. Not far, but they are below the PCR. So what we say is that this systematic testing should meet the criteria we have put forward, and up to now, the antigen testing are slightly better in terms of cost and speed than PCR, and they are worse in terms of sensitivity by 2 percentage points. Well, that's where we are. So we are trying to follow closely, the evolution of the industry and of science to ensure that the system we are proposing is particularly reliable and safe.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about our partners across the industry. So we've talked about working together with governments to try and ensure that the sector has sufficient aid, but are we concerned that airport or ANSP providers who have limited or large revenue streams coming from airlines, are we concerned that they will be seeking to raise their charges in order to ensure their financial viability? So maybe, Alexandre, that's one for you.
Of course, we are concerned that they increase their prices, because it would not help the traffic to recover if we increase the prices of the ticket at the end of the day. So that's the reason why we associate all the members of the chain in our request for financial support.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about business travel, and I guess there are a couple of parts to this. One is we've seen in several places lanes or specific business travel purpose bubbles being established. So have they had an impact on business travel? And more generally, what trends are we seeing for the evolution of business traffic?
Business travel is extremely low at the moment. Obviously, we're on a Teams call today, and video conferencing is the communication method of preference today. We survey every month corporate travel buyers. They're telling us that more than half of them are saying their business travel levels are going to be less than 10% of normal conditions, and I think we've seen this borne out in the ticketing and the experience. So even the green lanes that have been open in Asia for business travel have been not very substantially used. I think at the moment the level of economic activity is such that businesses don't need to travel, and that's a real challenge for, well, first of all, the economic viability of a number of long-haul routes, which traditionally do depend on premium paying passengers, which are typically the business traveller, and also many airline business models, which are based on those business travellers really driving the profitability of the business. So yes, the weakness of business travel is a serious concern for the industry at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have another question asking if the performance in September will impact the estimations we've made public on the number of jobs that are at risk in the industry.
No. I think I said earlier that the last 2 months, these weaker numbers have actually been right in line with that lower downgraded passenger forecasts that we published recently, and we then estimated what the implications were for the people employed in the airline industry and in the supply chain and the wider economy. So those numbers are consistent. The job loss numbers are consistent with what we're seeing happening at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay. And then we have one further question. We've talked about the UK lockdown, but the questioner is asking for any impact on the French lockdown, or anything particularly we see in the French market.
Alexandre, do you want to take that one?
The French market for the lockdown has the same impact as everywhere. It reduced the level of travels.
And you'll recall that in a slide I presented earlier that businesses in France seem to have lost confidence in a way that they haven't in economies like Germany. So I think clearly a number of economies in Europe are going to struggle in the face of the renewed lockdowns.
Yeah, and I suppose it's good news that there's also some testing activity going on in France. Alexandre, did you want to comment on that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, I was going to say, I suppose it's good news that the French authorities are looking at testing and doing some pilots and actual implementations in the airport.
Yeah, I think it's good news. But as you know, there are very few travel restrictions and for international passengers and quarantine measures in France.
Okay. So I think I see a few more questions in the queue, but they tend to be related to either a forecast for year end or outlook into 2021. And on both of those issues, at our annual general meeting, which takes place on the 24th of this month, we will be issuing a new outlook. So that will see a revision to our financial figures for this year, as well as our outlook into 2021. So those questions are great questions, but we'll save them until we have the outlook firmed up and ready to present on the 24th. And then there were several other questions, I think, just around the area of impact of the European lockdown, which I think we've handled several times. So with that, I think we're finished with questions for this week. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you have any questions going forward, please send them to corpcoms@iata.org, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.